Hey everybody, this is Amy Chen Mills with Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. And today we are presenting the second part of a two-part interview with my old colleague, Michael Mechanic, that I produced originally in, I believe, 2021 on a show called Unheard Voices. Michael Mechanic writes about super wealthy people and how they really live and how their wealth harms us all. Now, this topic has become very alive for me and for the rest of U.S. society after the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO, which brought out a lot of the frustration that American people are having about the wealth disparity in this country and how so much wealth is being siphoned from the lower and middle classes into the pockets and bank accounts of the top 10 and top 1%. who have recently taken over our entire government and will come into office on January 20th. The silver lining for me in all of this and the perhaps spot of leverage is that a lot of these wealthy people are not happy. They are very aware of the anger against them. And in fact, as this interview will discuss, have taken great pains to create underground bunkers and safe rooms within safe rooms to protect themselves from the rest of the population because they understand how angry people are. Now, another bright note is that some of the executives of big companies like Adidas and Amazon have come out in the Netflix documentary, for example, called Buy Now, to say, look, we're done with this. We're harming the environment. We're harming each other. And I think that there's a lot of potential there, especially when these people aren't really happy and content. And that's what Michael Mechanic talks about a lot with me. We also talk about what has happened to the IRS over the last few decades, where their budget and their capacity to even audit wealthy people has gone down dramatically. We talk about the apocalyptic mindset of these millionaires and billionaires. We talk about how Barack Obama's presidency created a backlash and a sense from, and actually a resolution from Republicans and the far right to stop him from getting really anything meaningful done. We talk about women and gender and how having women in leadership roles would really help. And then we talk about what is the hope going forward. We have some video footage also of Michael Mechanic on our Moment of Truth bonus video channel at YouTube. Just search it up. And you can find our first episode now in the archives and on Spotify and Apple, where our podcast is found under Amy Chen Mills. Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. Just search it up online. I think these two interviews together are super important at this time. And I think they are both well worth a listen. Thank you for joining us. Today we have Michael Mechanic back with us, the author of JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Michael, it's a great privilege and pleasure to have you back. For folks who don't know, Michael Mechanic actually is a former local journalist. He was a staff writer at Metro Santa Cruz. In fact, we used to sit together with our desks actually facing each other, writing for Metro Santa Cruz when it first started here in town, eventually became the Good Times. And Michael went on to do all kinds of journalistic and musical things. He did serve as a news editor for a little while at Metro Santa Cruz. And then he ended up at Mother Jones as a senior editor and has just come out with this book called JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. And just to sort of, this is our part two with Michael, because there was so much to cover in the book that it felt like it'd be worthwhile to get him back on the air with us. And just to sort of give you a recap, if you want to go back and listen to the last recording with Michael, go to ksqd.org and click on programs and then talk and podcasts, and you'll see Unheard Voices there. Click on that. You'll get Michael's recording from the last time we talked with him. But we covered a lot of things. I think we really covered the spiritual, psychological, sort of the happiness factor of wealth and how it's actually great wealth is not all it's cracked up to be. We covered that in depth. And then we also, we covered a little bit about people of color and women. We're going to get into that more today because we didn't have time to really discuss that in the last show. But there's one thing I want to point out, Michael, which keeps kind of coming up for me, which is that not only have tax rates on the wealthy gone down tremendously in the United States over the last, decades, right? But here's something I didn't know from your book, that I learned in your book, is that the IRS has been gutted, and so even if wealthy people are supposed to pay taxes, and let's say they're not through some sort of illegal means or through fraud or through hiding their money, the IRS is not even auditing them. So I think you had a figure like 23%. They used to audit people who had $10 million of income every year or more at a rate of 23%. They are down to 0.003%, not 3%, 0.003%. Do I have that right?
I think so, yeah. Either that or it's 0.03, but either way, it's minuscule.
It's pretty small.
It was in 2010 under Obama that it kind of peaked, and then it kind of dwindled. And so basically anyone making over, 10 million, but also 5 million a year, is barely getting touched. And so now more people are being audited who have no money, essentially.
More people are being... Okay, go ahead.
I said those people are easy to audit because these are very simple forms, but the super wealthy have all these lawyers and they have opaque partnerships and they have these incredibly complicated financial situations. And actually quite deliberately, the IRS has been deprived of the brain power to do these kinds of forensic auditing.
Yeah.
And this is basically based on, more than a decade of Republican attacks on the IRS and defunding and just mass layoffs, and they're super demoralized over there.
Are they really? Yeah, I can imagine. I think you said in your book they've been slashed by at least 20%. So they don't have the man and women power to go out and actually do these audits. And you were also saying in our last interview, no one loves the IRS. It's going to be a hard political sell to say, hey, let's beef up the IRS.
Yeah, they don't have any natural constituency gunning for them. I mean, people don't go out and picket and say, we want more money for the IRS.
Right.
Nobody likes taxes.
Right.
So that's, and the thing is, things are so slanted in favor of the wealthy in terms of taxation. And not only that, the wealthy have this whole industry of people who are actively trying to minimize their clients' taxes. We call it the wealth defense industry. A massive industry is growing fast, along with the explosion of wealth at the high end. And when these people are working for you, their advice to you is, let's maximize wealth, minimize taxes. And they know all the tricks. They have the lawyers, they have the expertise,
right? And
they know how to do it. And then people with less means don't have those sophisticated tricks at their disposal. And so in some way, it's not really the super rich people themselves driving the avoidance of taxation. It's the people they hire and who make money off this that is also helping to lobby to, make the rules so that they can get more money for this industry.
Oh, right. Because the more wealth your clients have, the more you get to charge them.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's directly proportional in many cases. In many cases, if you're charging your wealthy clients, you're charging them by the amount of money you have under management. It's like a percentage fee.
Right.
So
right.
The more they have, the more you can save them, the more you make.
Right. So there's a definite self-interest there for people who are in what you call the entourages of the wealthy, trying to protect that money. And it's, I just want to say when you talk about wealth, this kind of wealth, we're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and even into the billions are the people that you looked at in terms of lifestyle and taxation rates and so on and so forth, and what that's doing to our country. There's a part of me that just I feel sad. I feel like I almost want to cry because there's something about that to me is just, look, even in your old hometown, Santa Cruz, we have homeless encampments everywhere here. We have, people who can't buy medical insurance, right? Because it's so expensive and we're not willing to provide medical insurance for all in this country. we're willing to fund the Afghanistan war, but we're not willing to make education free for all, higher education, for example. It just, it hurts my heart, you know?
Right. I mean, the priorities, our national priorities are so askew. This is so much in the background for most people.
Yeah.
They don't go around thinking about it. But here's a stat I saw the other. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you just had to guess, I mean, you may have, from the book, you'll probably be informed on this, but what percentage of the national wealth do you think is owned by the least wealthy 50% of the population?
What percentage of the national? Okay, so I'm.
So the bottom 50% owns how much?
20%.
Okay, 2%.
Oh, what?
And 2%, and that is actually an improvement. It was back 10 years ago. It was like 0.7%. So half of the population owns literally nothing. You know?
Oh my Lord, that is insane.
And we consider, if you think this America is a land of opportunity, well, that kind of screws up your argument right there.
Right.
Because if America was a land of opportunity where everyone had an equal chance to succeed, you wouldn't have this crazy, this crazy skew in the wealth from bottom to top. I mean, it blows me away every time I think about it. So the bottom 40% has nothing.
Right.
I mean, literally nothing. Taken collectively.
It's, I think the reason it hurts my heart is because somehow I believe that, you can have your mansion, you can have your gated community, you can have your security code, at your front gate and your security cameras and everything else. You can have your bunker in New Zealand, which is what some of these wealthy people are starting to build.
Peter Thiel.
What's that?
Peter Thiel.
Peter Thiel. Is he the, who is he?
PayPal. He's the PayPal
guy, right? He's got a compound in New Zealand.
He actually became a New Zealand citizen.
Okay.
In part, well, we don't know whether it was to flee taxes, but that might be part of it. But he also has these, he loves Lord of the Rings. he's kind of, some of these guys have this sort of apocalyptic view. Like if there's total society falls apart, I have an escape route.
Well, a lot of them have an apocalyptic view. I mean, we've seen some Medium essays from consultants who've talked to hedge fund managers who talk about, how can I protect my assets and my wealth? In fact, there was one writer and author on Medium, and I don't have his name right here in front of me, but he was invited to a fancy conference, paid a huge amount of money, like what he normally would make in half a year or something for this one conference. And these hedge fund managers, he was a futurist, and they wanted to sit down with him and talk about the future and technology. And they ended up having this big discussion about if we have our armed guards, at our bunkers when sort of the event happens. They kept referring to something called the event, whether it's climate crisis and collapse or whether it's pitchforks and, populism or who knows what. And their question to him was, how do we keep our armed guards motivated if the monetary system has collapsed? So they were in a conundrum.
Rice and beans.
What's that?
Give them rice and beans. Give them gold. I don't know. The hedge funders in particular, it's interesting you brought that up because one of the characters in my book is a guy who builds luxury safe rooms.
Right.
And most of his clients are hedge funders. And he says these guys have houses that are $50, $100 million. They have underground indoor basketball courts, underground theaters, bowling alley. I mean, insane stuff.
Right.
And, one guy had his wine cellar with like millions of dollars worth of wine in there. He had it, plated with Kevlar, etc. Some people have these like walk-in closets.
Uh-huh.
And then, but the walk-in closet is a safe room. And then within the safe room, there's another safe room with like a slot in the door that you can shoot out of.
Okay, like the safer room, but also
the safer room. And he also said this. So this guy, he's an Irish guy. Had spent a bunch of time in Iraq because he was in charge of armoring some of the U.S. convoys, and they were sleeping outside of the green zone in, these, I don't know, some little hotels or something, and they were, there was a lot of sectarian violence, and they felt like a target. So they had guns. They would sleep with a gun under their pillow, and he said while there, he kind of thought about the strategy for how you do safe room design, because he figures anyone comes in here at 3 a.m, they're going to be alert, on mission, motivated. And maybe the person like him would have been up the night before drinking, and, you're going to be fumbling around and so forth. And so his whole takeaway from that is you build a safe room that's like a room that you use every day, not some special room.
I see. So like your whole house becomes a safe room?
No, it's usually like your master bedroom or your theater or whatever. And you just go in there and you hit a big button on the wall, and electromagnetic locks go into play, and your air filtration system goes on, and your redundant communications start. I mean, it's crazy. But what I was trying to get at here was with the recent hedge funders, and I'm like, that's crazy. You're spending $500,000 to arm your master bedroom, and he's like, yeah, but that's like for a normal person, that's like getting a little home security system with ADP security or whatever.
Right.
Because these guys, I figure, that's risk is what they do for a living. They manage risk. That's sort of the business they're in. So they must always be thinking about, okay, well, this is probably not going to happen, but I'm going to hedge my bets. Like, that's what they hedge their bets.
Right. And you actually have almost a whole chapter in your book about how the very, very wealthy in this country and probably around the world actually pay a lot of attention to what people are saying about them. And that's sort of feeding into their paranoia. And, rather than maybe turning around and saying, hey, let's change the tax code so that this is not so obscene, and people don't get so angry. Let's actually, it sounds like they're just going to build these bunkers in New Zealand or where have you. Now, that's not everybody. And I want to get to the parts of your book where you talk about wealthy people and some of the foundations and initiatives that they have actually more progressive or more compassionate wealthy people have started to put together, to establish, to try to change things. And just for everyone who's tuning in just now, this is Michael Mechanic. He's the author of the new book from Simon & Schuster, JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. He's also a former local journalist from Santa Cruz, so we're very proud of him
Thank you.
and everything he's accomplished. He's now a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, too. And so when I say this hurts my heart, I just feel like a lot of people in the United States, and I think you also mentioned in your book, this fueled Trumpism to some extent. People are just feeling like there are wealthy, powerful people who are so far away from where I am in my station in life that it's making me angry or afraid or out of control. Like I have no power. I have no way of changing my situation. And so I imagine that this book has really made an impact. I know I've seen a photo of Elizabeth Warren holding your book, reading your book, JackPot. And so I'm just curious because it's been a month since we last spoke. The book has been out for 2 months or so?
No, it's actually came out in April.
Okay, so it's been out for 4 months now.
April, May, June, July. Yeah, this is the 5th month.
Okay.
It's been 5 months, yeah.
Okay, 5 months. And you've been through a lot of interviews. You've probably had a lot of conversations. Tell me how the reception has been, and has there been anything gratifying about the reception that you've seen to this book, or anything maybe not so gratifying?
Well, it's mostly been very gratifying, mainly because a lot of people I respect have read it and really liked it. It's funny, you don't usually hear a lot from book subjects. I've talked to other authors about this who write nonfiction, and only a few have gotten back to me and made any comment whatsoever. And I said, I wonder why that is, are they mad at me?
Right.
I don't know.
Often they are, to be honest.
They might, or they might figure they've said their piece and they have nothing more to say. I don't know. Personally, if someone wrote about me, I would probably send them an email or something. But most of the people that have gotten back to me were, one guy, actually a guy who used to live in Santa Cruz and moved to Ross. He said, he's a coder, made a fortune first. Then he hit the jackpot at Netscape, which was a really crazy, absurd. It was like the first .com.
I remember Netscape
thing that took off, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was actually the first company that went wild on the stock market, and all these kids were like millionaires suddenly, and it was a bizarre experience for them. And so he said, I sent my book to all the people in the book, and he said, I got your book, and I just wouldn't even open it for a while because I was just afraid.
Right. Right.
And finally, a friend of his got in touch with him and said, "Hey, you got to read the book." And so he read the book, and he said, "Oh, you treated me fairly." I mean, the whole idea of this book was not to, piss on the rich. It was to understand them and to understand how, like, our lust for wealth and the way wealth is tied into our culture and politics is affecting the society more broadly. So, it wasn't to shame anyone. It was to look at the system and look at how everybody plays into that system, including people who don't have money, and the way we fantasize about wealth and hold these myths about wealth that kind of drive this culture of desire to, get to this place. It is kind of it's not a healthy thing for the society because, when you hold these truths, like you believe that there's this social mobility that really doesn't exist.
Right.
And you believe that you could be the guy who is living in the mansion.
Right.
So we shouldn't tax those people because I might be there someday.
I might be there. Right.
I mean, there's sort of this, we have an unawareness of how severely unequal the society has become wealth-wise. I mean, when you asked, like I asked you about the bottom of 50%, and you just threw out, "Oh, they probably own 20% of the wealth," but then that's pretty common. That's what the common answer would be.
And I feel like that's a low number.
Right.
But it's actually
2%.
2%.
And you're like, holy cow, really?
Yeah, right.
2%.
Right. It's out of hand.
But I would say so. Some of the folks that I talk to, because I'm from Mother Jones, and the super conservative rich people aren't going to probably talk to me because they don't trust Mother Jones. There was probably some selection bias in terms of who agreed to talk to me. People who are more progressive.
Sure.
And you hear, and a few of them are really actually trying to do things just to some degree to like level the playing field economically. Or, they might be, but the thing is they still live incredibly wealthy lives.
Yeah.
And they still have all the advantages. It's just they see that it's not necessarily a good thing for society. And if you want to have a stable society and thriving society where people are, happy and productive, you have to have a strong middle class.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There's a woman you mentioned actually named Tracy Gary, and I want to get to her because she just struck me as a role model for wealthy people, where she really realized, look, this isn't making me happy. And she saw it not making her parents happy to have these hundreds of millions of dollars. And she ended up giving most of it away and going to work for a living and getting a smaller, just a apartment, although an ocean view apartment in Tiburon, right? And, but just deciding, this is how I want to be. I want to be communal. I want to support the common good. And that seems to be what we're missing here in the United States, that sense of we somehow the common good affects us. We're connected to each other. And
it's actually those connections with community and people, that's what makes people happy.
Right.
I mean, there was, I had it in my book and I took it out at some point, but there was a Harvard study that looked at, it started way back in, like the 20s or something. It was a longitudinal study where it went over multiple generations, and they had a bunch of young people from South Boston and a bunch of Harvard students from wealthy families, and they tracked them over their lives and then their children's lives and their children's lives. And one thing that just kept coming up in all of these things is no matter how successful they were, it was the people who felt really interconnected and had a lot of ties and friendships and stuff. Those were the people who were happy. It really had nothing to do with success and material wealth and so forth.
Yeah.
And it can have the opposite effect, because when you're spend so much of your time striving and trying to, get more and get status and get power and get money, you sacrifice a lot. You don't have time for other things. You don't have time for people.
Right.
You're using people. Things are transactional when you're in that kind of mode.
Right.
And people can end up living their whole lives thinking they're going for this goal, and that they'll be happy when they get there, but really they're miserable. And it's just not good for them. It's not good for society.
Yeah. We're going to have to take a break at the half-hour mark, but I wanted to make sure we got into some of the chapters that you wrote about Black people. You have a chapter called Thriving While Black.
My favorite chapter title.
And also about women. But, part of me, when I read this stuff, I've been doing a lot of reading myself. I've been reading Caste. I've been reading White Rage. These are excellent. I feel like all Americans should be reading these books, all United States Americans. But it's something worth repeating, I think, because when I read these statistics, I thought, well, I've been learning this, so maybe people already know this. But actually, my producer, Howard, was saying, I don't know if everybody always really knows. You write here in your book, the median net worth of white U.S. households in 2016 was $171,000, according to one widely cited study, 10 times the wealth of Black households and 8 times that of Latino households. And the Institute for Policy Studies, using a different methodology, reports racial wealth disparities of 50 times and 25 times, respectively. So this is, when these kinds of figures are thrown out there, for a lot of people in this country who want to rationalize the way things are, in their minds, this equals, it becomes a racist argument. Okay, well, Black people aren't wealthy because they haven't worked hard enough, because they're lazy, because look at their family situations and the inner city situation. But you talk about a bunch of things that I think are really important for people to understand about the historical barriers to wealth. I mean, besides just the fact of slavery, right, and how this all started. Is there anything you want to share in particular? I do have some things that I have sort of outlined in this chapter.
Well, I mean, one could go on for a long time about this. But what I was trying to highlight is not just sort of the individual acts of racism that are obviously a factor in people's lives. And, I think ever since, even before Obama came along, when Obama came along, it gave people an excuse to say, white people an excuse to say, racism is over.
Right.
Look, there's a Black president. Actually, all this, so much of the political backlash from the right was spurred by having a Black president.
Yeah, I know. It's it's tragic. Yeah.
I mean, people were not happy about having a Black president. I mean, well, a lot of people were, but the right was enraged by this.
Yeah.
And from the very beginning, when he took office, we are not going to help this guy pass anything. Like, it was just, everything was defined in opposition to him.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to get through to in the book is to look at the actual sort of structural things that prevented Black wealth, prevented Black families from accumulating wealth, from protecting themselves, from having wealth they could pass on to their kids. And if you look at the wealth disparity now and you blame it on people being lazy, well, it's completely misguided. And of course, that still is the attitude of some people.
Right.
But when you go back, okay, so people say the idea is, slavery happened all this a long time ago. It's over. Get over it. Just get over it. That Black people hear that stuff. And it's infuriating because even before slavery ended, the U.S. government, this is one thing I write about that you don't hear about much, is there were a pair of acts called the Homestead Acts.
Right.
And this was the biggest public to private wealth transfer in American history. You got to remember, we were an agrarian culture then. Land was everything.
Right.
People farmed. That's how money was made. And all of a sudden the government said, we have all this public land. You can have 160 acres if you just come to one of the land offices, fill out a form, pay a nominal fee, and then go live on that land and improve it for 5 years. Then you could apply and that land would be yours. So ultimately, so the first half of this act was enacted at the end of the Civil War when the slavery was still in progress in the South. So obviously, Black families couldn't take advantage of it. And the second part of it was the Southern Homestead Act, which was specifically Southern land, but a lot of it wasn't suitable for farming, first of all. And second of all, because of the structures that had been set up after slavery, it became very hard for Black people practically to apply for that land and live on that land because they didn't have the resources to get to the land offices and to basically make it through until they could have a harvest and any of these things, right? You needed some kind of resources. So in the end, the federal government gave land to 1.4 million white families and about 5,000 black families. So, so some of the things are, we are shutting you out because you're black. And other things is we are giving this huge advantage to people who are white and leaving black folks behind. So both of those things kind of conspire to rob black families of the ability to generate wealth.
I think the Homestead Act is so important because, as you write here in your book, any adult male, white adult male, head of household or Union military veteran could lay claim to a 160-acre parcel. Mm-hmm. One only had to apply, pay a modest fee, make improvements for 5 years, and then file for a deed of ownership. So this impacted, of course, the indigenous population in this nation. And of course, black people were not included in this first Homestead Act, which had repercussions for white wealth versus black wealth on down through the decades and centuries, right? So we're going to take a quick break for a station ID and a few announcements from our producer, and we will be right back with Michael Mechanic, author of JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All.
KSQD thanks GPI Builders for supporting this program. GPI Builders is a locally owned and operated full-service construction company with more than 10 years of experience and expertise. GPI Builders specializes in home additions, ADUs, and residential remodels throughout the Bay Area. For more information, 1-800-916-8343 or gpibuilders.com. Thank you, GPI Builders, for supporting community radio, K-Squid.
Today we have Michael Mechanic on Unheard Voices with me. He is a former journalist from Santa Cruz, now a senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine, and he is the author of a new book called JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. And we're talking about right now a chapter in his book called Thriving While Black, about the barriers to wealth that I think a lot of white people just don't really want to think about or look at, especially wealthy white people, because that would be an argument to share and to give back and possibly to make reparations. And all these things to me would be healthy and healing and wonderful. The other thing that you talk about, besides the Homestead Acts, which really left black people with much, much less of the land given out at that time after the Civil War, you also talk about exclusion legislation and redlining, and how, if, for example, in 1890, there were black settlers in all of Montana's 56 counties. By 1930, there were few blacks in any of them, and 11 counties were exclusively white. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, that was Jim Crow, and it was all over the country.
Yeah, and we don't realize that. We think, oh, it was the South.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there was, I just read there's a book by Clint Smith, it's a bestseller out now called How the Word Was Passed. And there's a chapter in that book that talks about slavery in New York. And it's really unbelievable how big a part New York City played in the slave trade. I mean, we think North versus South, actually it was East, West, everywhere. Mm. And what I try to get across to people is, like, even the people who were against slavery, even the people who thought it was bad, white people benefited from it. And in fact, white people still benefit from this legacy. Even, no matter, people say, I'm not a racist. Nobody in my family did anything that was racist. Or you hear the argument, well, my family came to the U.S. after slavery. We were immigrants, so we couldn't have had anything to do with that. But you're still benefiting from the racist policies of the past. And it's kind of incredible when you look back and sort of see how exclusive things were. I mean, first of all, the separate but equal idea, it was upheld by the Supreme Court. Of course, it's nonsense because it wasn't equal at all. It meant that the people with all the wealth and the connections were over here, and all the black people were over here, and they had no resources to kind of build themselves up. Then, of course, so there was the real estate exclusion. Then there was the exclusion starting in the 30s with the federal loans, in which the federal government passed the Federal Housing Act believe it was called. I may be wrong. And at that time, around the time of the Depression, it was kind of hard for anyone to get a loan unless you had a lot of wealth. The terms were really onerous. And the federal government said, hey, we should help people buy homes. And so what we can do is we can insure the loans so that banks can make these loans with like better terms. And so, of course, I mean, you probably all know this story. They had people auditing. Realtors were hired to audit, where the loans should be made. And the real estate profession actually had in their code of ethics, segregation was built into their code of ethics, which is, so backward. So they created these maps that were, the red zones were high risk, and the red zones just happened to be, well, they didn't just happen to be, they were deliberately mixed race and black areas. And there were all kinds of crazy things in the, FHA manual, that's the Federal Housing Authority, in the manual saying, well, you don't loan over here because there are bad racial elements. There was just all this awful language. If you want to read a great book about this, there's a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which I drew from quite a bit in that part. So, I mean, that is a real deep dive into this, and it's fascinating. So I recommend that. But this stuff has continued, and it still continues even now. You can see it. You can see it in the way people go into a realty office, and they get shown houses in, the whites get shown houses in white areas, black people get shown houses in majority black areas, and there's all these sort of perverse things that happen when you have the segregation, including there's been a number of studies showing that in black and majority minority neighborhoods, people pay higher property taxes. Housing prices don't grow as much. There's all sorts of things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
what do you mean? What do you mean? You mean percentage-wise, they pay higher property taxes? Is that
yes? As I put it in the book, for the same bundle of public services, they pay a higher percentage property tax, than wealthier communities.
Right. I just want to go ahead. I'm sorry.
This is almost everywhere in the United States now.
Yeah, but my mother is Chinese American. She immigrated here and became a citizen after I was born here. And she tells stories about going to look for houses in Palo Alto when she bought her first house. And there's old Palo Alto. I don't know if you're familiar with old Palo Alto, but some of these, multi-billionaires live there in old Palo Alto. The houses are huge. Mm-hmm. And I think she was looking at a house over there, and she told the story that her real estate agent said to her, I don't think this is the place for you. And then also the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of my first shows for Unheard Voices was about how there was a fishing village that was thriving, a Chinese fishing village just south of the Monterey Bay Aquarium that really established the fishing industry in this area. And it was burned to the ground, probably as a result of arson. And then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act on top of that. And the wealth that Asian people, and I'm sure so many other people of color in this country were trying to build, kept getting undermined, because of white supremacy.
Right. And there were groups that, you'd say, okay, when the Irish first came to this country, they were treated very badly. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Jews. Mm-hmm. And essentially, those groups and the Germans were treated badly when they came. All the new immigrants are treated badly.
Right.
But the ones with lighter skin who were able to kind of pass into the white community, even the Italians, they were considered dark people, but they became white people.
Right.
And the Jews became, they became part of the white culture. So they all did well after a couple of generations. But both the legacy of slavery and also like the people who came from kind of poorer places, and the people with darker skin, they've always had much more trouble being accepted by the majority culture.
Yeah, darker skin or more different looking like Chinese people are.
Exactly, yeah.
I get kind of upset because I look in, the San Lorenzo Valley, you've got Ben Lomond, you've got Loch Lomond, you've got Scots, you've got these names that relate to Scotland and Scottish people. Mm-hmm. And you have a Chinese cemetery that who knows who's in there, and there's we finally put up like a marker on Front Street, which is it looks like a gateway to a Chinatown, but there's no Chinatown there. It's just the gateway. And there's no, right. I just, we could have all these other things that are Chinese, right? But no, because that's just too, there was just a lot of racism against the Chinese. And you know what, Michael, how would you feel about taking a phone call question? If anyone wants to call in, would that be all right with you?
Yes, sir.
All right. So if you'd like to talk to Michael Mechanic, the author of JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All, if you have any thoughts or ideas or you have a question for Michael, give us a call at 831-900-5773. That's 831-900-5773. 5773 is also KSQD. I think that's kind of nifty. So let's move on to women. I wanted to talk about women a little bit, but I also want to come to like the alternatives and the solutions and what we can do, which you also talk about in your book and which I think is so important. We talked about women a little bit in our last interview, which is in the archives at the K-Squid website. But I mean, I know a lot about what the obstacles women have faced to owning wealth, owning homes, voting, everything now. I mean, the abortion laws that have just been passed in Texas. I'm horrified. I'm horrified. But do you want to share anything about? I'm upset as a woman, just to be honest. Yeah, it's like the worst thing that's happened. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you say you're upset, here's what I always think about.
Okay.
Why do we have to have women's issues and black issues and whatever? Why does it have to be siloed like that? Because, aren't women's issues everyone's issues? Men should be just as upset about what's happening in Texas.
Yes, they should, because it's their issue. I mean, It's their issue. They're the ones with the problem. Not the women are not the ones with the problem. Okay, I'm going to get on my pedestal here. Okay. Somebody better call in and interrupt me.
And the especially crazy thing about that is sort of the McCarthy-esque, narking on your neighbor.
I know.
I mean, that is insane. So this bill is basically deputizes private citizens to sue.
I know.
Abortion providers.
To be snitches. To be snitches, to be out there informing on their fellow, or their, what's the word for fellow that's feminine, on their women, citizens that are around them and residents that are around them. But going back to wealth in your book, one of the points you make about wealth is how women handle it differently. And I was thinking about the documentary that Michael Moore produced called Where to Invade Next. And
I saw that.
Yeah, he has a whole segment about not just free education, higher education, which is actually available in many European countries, but not ours, heaven forbid. Let's not even go there, is sort of the attitude. That I think it was Iceland, where women are required to be 50% of any board. So any bank corporate board has to have 50% women. And when the 2008 recession hit and the whole housing market crashed, actually it didn't crash in Iceland because of that, because women were not making these risky investments the way that men were.
This is true. They found this out in studies. Women invest more conservatively. They are more risk averse, but that's probably good because men do these seat of the pants kind of investments that they go on instinct. Women are more deliberative in their decision making, and so they trade less and they end up making more.
Yeah.
But the trouble is they still don't have access to the capital.
Right.
I mean, so many. You look at. I think in the book I had that. In a decade, they looked at all the new hedge firms that had launched,
right? And
only like 3% of them were launched by firms, only 3% had women hedge fund managers, or launched or were co-managers. And it's because the women, if a woman is in charge of a hedge fund, she can't attract enough investment because people, these mostly men with the money, and they don't trust the women with the money.
Right.
Although they perform just as well.
Right.
If they do have the money.
Right.
So it's a really perverse situation. Now, I've been thinking about this lately because right now the Elizabeth Holmes trial is happening in San Jose. And, she was the one who started this company, Stanford. She was 19 or something. She started this company called Theranos for blood testing diagnostics. And she sort of fancied herself like a Steve Jobs protege. She would wear a black turtleneck. She would lower her voice when she went into meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And she spoke of this. People had heard her speak in her natural voice. It was much higher. She would lower her voice for these meetings because she wanted to be taken more seriously. She managed to sort of woo all these very powerful people and, sell this sort of fantasy idea of this black box you could put a drop of blood in and you could test for like everything,
Mm-hmm.
And it was too good to be true. And it wasn't working and they covered it up. And she was basically accused of defrauding she became, the company was valued at billions of dollars. She was a billionaire. And anyway, now, she's been accused of fraud. She's now on trial. So the point here is that there are so few women who are able to attract that kind of investment.
Yeah. That
now it's like women are complaining, and women entrepreneurs are complaining, oh, this is hurting me.
Mm-hmm.
Because now all men who were, in control of the money spigot are even less likely to make the woman jump through even higher.
Because she represents all women.
Yes, because there's so few. And this happens. There's a woman in my book called Kim Polese who was the founder, co-founder of a company called Marimba.
Uh-huh.
And she was actually on the original team at Sun Microsystems that created Java, which is used, it's basically the whole internet runs on Java.
Right.
She even named it Java. It was going to be called Oak. But Forbes wrote this big snarky article comparing her to, who's the lean-in woman?
Oh gosh, Sharon from Facebook.
Oh,
I forget her name.
Can't believe I forgot her name.
Yeah.
Sheryl Sandberg. Yeah. So it was kind of like, Sheryl Sandberg better watch out. She's going to make the same mistakes as Kim Polese, and talking about how the two women were so similar because this and that. And they had actually kind of treated Kim as a flameout when in fact her company was remarkably successful.
Right.
And she just, she was so upset by this.
Right.
It's like, what? We're two women CEOs, so you're just going to use us as this sort of, I don't know. I mean, the journalism around the business journalism was so sexist.
So sexist, right? But I want to interrupt you because I mean, it's great to promote, women, I guess, having more wealth or becoming hedge fund managers. I'm sort of at this place where I don't, and we said this on the last show as well. I think what we really need to do is be sharing the wealth and have more women in power, whether that's over, banks or corporations or government. And to me, that's one solution to what we're facing because, historically and even in studies, women have been shown to be more collaborative and thinking more about how everybody's doing and not so individualistic and sort of aggressive and assertive and let me get mine kind of a situation, right? They're more sort of, I don't know why. It might be their brains. It might be their conditioning. And certainly men can have, these great feminine qualities too. But I want to talk a little bit about, like, for instance, one woman who, not a hedge fund manager, but a very wealthy woman in your book, Tracy Gary, who gave away a lot of her wealth because she realized it wasn't making her happy. And then these other people in your book, the final chapter, The Perfect Storm, you talk about groups like Patriotic Millionaires, Resource Generation, and Solidaire Network, which I guess are organizations that wealthy people have formed to try to give back, to try to change things. I mean, where do you see the most hope in terms of reducing income inequality in the United States? And and being more like, I have the Happy Dane here again in the studio with me, which is about Denmark and how they pay 50% tax rate at $66,000 a year, and they're fine with it. They love it. And they're always ranked the number one in happiness and well-being levels in the world. And so, we need to get there, right? And we also need to deal with climate change, and all this takes money, and it takes redistributing the money in this country. Right. So, what do you think is most hopeful? What do you think the solutions are for us, whether we're voting or whether we're wealthy people? And I know you have resources in your book as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I wasn't suggesting that having more women hedge fund managers wasn't going to save us. Well, I guess what I was saying is that, like you said, when women are part of financial planning, like banking, in kind of control of a family's wealth situation, as opposed to being the spouse of some billionaire who, has his entourage do everything. When women are involved, they think about who benefits from these things, and the men tend to like invest in a what's in it for me kind of attitude, like how can I make the most money? And women tend to be a lot more like, how does this affect everybody? They're thinking about other sort of stakeholders, and they're thinking about the planet. They're thinking about various things. So I mean, I do think having more women in finance positions could be a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's certainly control their own finances, because that for a long time, I mean, I kind of just, older women would know this obviously viscerally, but I learned that when I was a kid in 1974, prior to 1974, a woman could not walk into a bank and apply for a loan without her husband's signature. They just wouldn't lend to women, but period.
Right.
And all the bankers were male. And so if you were a woman and you have a good idea to start a business, you better get your husband on board, because otherwise you never get money.
Right. Yeah.
And what if you don't have a husband? What if you're gay? What if you're a widow? What if you're single? Forget it.
Right.
And so women were just put at a disadvantage historically. And they still have to jump through hoops when they go and ask these all-male venture capital firms for funding. Anyway, so as far as groups like Patriotic Millionaires, what I would say about those kinds of groups is they are a very small percentage of wealthy people, like people like Tracy Gary, people like Chuck Collins, who gave away a pretty substantial Oscar Mayer fortune. He was an heir to that family, the meatpacking family, when he was a kid, and basically became an anti-inequality crusader. You get people like that, and who are actually lobbying the government. This was something Patriotic Millionaires does. It lobbies the government to change its tax policy.
That's amazing.
Tax rich people more. But it's a small group,
right.
A few hundred people, maybe a few hundred people. And then at the other end, you have tens of thousands of what's called a family office, which are these basically private companies that are created by very wealthy families to manage their financial interests. And those family offices get together and lobby to keep these tax advantages. So you have like this small minority at one end, this small minority at the other end, and then most rich people in the middle are kind of neither one way or the other. They're just going about their business.
So Michael, it
right?
sounds like we need a revolution. And I just have to jump in because we've only got a minute left.
Well, we need a revolution in thought.
In thought, yes, absolutely. Especially if these people aren't happy. That's the thing that keeps getting me, is they don't seem happy, and happiness actually lies somewhere else. So we're talking with Michael Mechanic, the author of JackPot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
We're going to have to go now. Moment of Truth gives many, many thanks to our team, Nyanko Nyasu, sound and tech engineer, and our research and production team, Nyanko, Mailing Obinata, Todd Zimmerman, and Vara Ramakrishnan. Todd Zimmerman of Native Verse Studios created the theme song. Kathy Krizik created our logo. Find our podcast of this show and others at all your favorite podcast sites under Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. Episode notes and links to resources are at our program page at www.ksqd.org. Thanks to our KSQD program manager, Howard Feldstein, and the entire KSQD team on the California Central Coast. Please contact us at amy@ksqd.org with questions or comments. And remember, if we don't use our democracy, we lose our democracy. Okay, thanks everybody. Peace out.